On a dry afternoon in March of 1974, in Harper County, Kansas, a man named Walter Hensley stood at the edge of his land and watched dust rise like smoke from the fields around him. 30 acres. That's all he had planted in trees. Cottonwood, elm, a few stubborn rows of Osage orange. The rest of the county had torn theirs out years earlier. They said it wasted space. They said it wasted money. They said it wasted time. Across the fence line, a brand new John Deere 4020 pulled a disc through loose soil, green paint gleaming in the sun, 95 horsepower churning up what little moisture remained. The farmer driving it, young, clean boots, pressed shirt, cut the engine and waved. "Walter," he called, smiling the way a man does when he's already decided you're wrong. "You still babysitting those trees?" Walter didn't answer right away. He leaned on the fender of his tractor, a 1948 Farmer Lem, red faded to a dull, rusted rose, 40 horsepower on paper, but still pulling like something twice its size when it mattered. His hands told the story first. Cracked, thick, fingernails dark with soil that didn't wash out anymore. He rubbed his thumb across the edge of the metal and watched the horizon. "Not babysitting," he said quietly. "Growing something. Let me tell you about Walter Hensley. He bought that land in June of 1931, right in the middle of the Dust Bowl's early teeth, when banks were foreclosing faster than crops could grow. 30 acres cost him $1,200, borrowed money. All of it. The land wasn't much. Sandy loam, poor drainage, wind exposure from the southwest that could strip a field down to nothing in a single bad week. But Walter had seen something others didn't. He planted trees. Not crops, not wheat, not sorghum. Trees. People laughed then, too. Back in 1933, at the Harper County feed store, a man named Earl Donnelly, grain farmer, 300 acres, loud voice, louder opinions, slapped his knee and said it out loud for everyone to hear. "You don't farm trees, Walter. You cut them down. That's the whole point." The room laughed with him. Walter didn't. He just nodded once and went back to loading his feed. By 1940, most of the county had switched to larger equipment. Steel plows, heavier discs, deeper cuts. The land responded at first. Big yields, easy money. But it came at a cost nobody wanted to calculate. Topsoil started to thin. Wind started to matter. Walter kept planting. Row after row. Measured spacing. Windbreak angles calculated by nothing more than instinct and years of watching storms move across open land. His Farmer Lem came into the picture in 1948. Bought used for $1,350 from a dealer in Wichita. It had already worked 2 farms before his. Cast iron block. Simple carburetor. No electronics to fail. No sensors to complain. Just compression, fuel, and a man who knew how to listen to an engine. He maintained it like it was part of the family. Changed oil every 100 hours. Greased fittings religiously. Rebuilt the carburetor himself in 1956 with parts that came wrapped in brown paper and instructions that assumed you already knew what you were doing. That tractor never sat idle. By the early 1970s, though, the world had changed again. Big farms got bigger. Machines got newer. And men like Walter, quiet, deliberate, slow to adopt, became something people pointed at. That afternoon in March, the younger farmer crossed the fence line and walked over, boots barely touching the ground like he didn't quite belong to it. His name was Frank Donnelly, Earl's son, college-educated, agricultural economics, backed by a local bank that had just financed 2 new combines and a fleet of modern equipment worth over $200,000. "You could double your yield," Frank said, gesturing at the trees. "Triple it, maybe. You clear this out, run straight rows, maximize acreage. That's how it's done now." Walter looked at him, eyes steady. "Depends on what you're growing," he said. Frank laughed, not loudly at first. "Just enough. Wheat, Walter. Same as everyone else." Walter turned back toward the trees. The wind shifted slightly, carrying dust in the neighboring fields, but when it reached his land, it slowed, fell, settled into the roots and grass between the rows. He didn't point it out. He didn't need to. Frank followed his gaze, then shook his head. "You're holding on to something that doesn't make sense anymore," he said. Times change. Walter nodded. They do. There was a pause, long enough to feel uncomfortable. Frank looked back at the farmer. You still running that old thing? He asked. Walter's hand rested on the hood. Every day. Frank smirked. 40 horsepower, he said. My tractor's got more than double that. Efficiency matters now. Walter didn't argue. He just climbed up into the seat, turned the ignition, and let the engine come to life with that deep, steady rumble only old cast iron can produce. Depends, he said again, almost himself. Frank walked back toward his field, shaking his head. By the time he reached his tractor, the wind had started to pick up. Not much, just enough to move the top layer of loose soil, just enough for Walter to notice. He watched it for a long time, longer than most men would, because he had seen this before, and he knew exactly what came next. By the end of that week, the wind wouldn't just pick up, it would arrive. And when it did, Harper County would learn, again, what it had forgotten, but not before one more conversation that would change everything. The wind came on April 3rd, 1974. It didn't announce itself with thunder or rain. It came quiet at first, just a steady push out of the southwest, warm and dry, the kind of wind farmers usually welcome after a damp spell. By noon it had teeth, topsoil lifted in sheets. Not clouds, sheets. Long, low waves of dirt peeling off fields that had been tilled too fine, too loose, too exposed. The sky turned to dull, choking brown, and the horizon disappeared behind it. Frank Donnelly saw from the cab of his John Deere 4020. At first, he kept working. That's what modern farming taught you. Efficiency, momentum, pushing through conditions that used to stop men in their tracks. He lowered the disc another inch, thinking deeper cuts would help anchor the soil. They didn't. They made it worse. Let me tell you about soil the way old farmers understood it. Topsoil isn't just dirt. It's structure. Tiny aggregates bound together by organic matter, roots, moisture. When you overwork it, when you break it down too fine, it loses that structure. It becomes powder. And powder doesn't stay where you put it when the wind comes. It moves. By mid-afternoon, Frank couldn't see the end of his own field. The wind hit 35 miles per hour, gusting higher, and every pass of the disc sent another wave of soil into the air. He shut the tractor down. Too late. Across the county, other engines went quiet one by one. Men stood on porches, hats pulled low, watching decades of accumulated soil lift and drift toward the next county line. Except on one piece of land, Walter's. The trees didn't stop the wind entirely. Nothing could, but they broke it, slowed it, forced it upward, diffused its force, scattered its energy across trunks and branches and the uneven ground beneath, and the soil stayed. Not all of it, but enough to matter. That evening, as the wind howled against the side of the Donnelly farmhouse, Frank stood at the window, watching his fields disappear into the air. His father, Earl, sat at the kitchen table, silent for once. You ever see it like this? Frank asked. Earl didn't answer right away. I seen worse, he said finally. Back in 35. Thought we were past that. Frank turned back to the window. We are, he said. We've got better equipment now. Earl didn't look up. Equipment don't hold soil, he said. The wind didn't let up overnight, or the next day, or the day after that. By April 6th, Harper County looked like something out of another decade entirely. Fence lines buried, roads drifting shut, fields stripped down a hardpan in places where crops should have been planted within weeks. And then there was Walter's land. Frank drove out there on the morning of April 7th. He didn't call ahead, didn't announce himself, just climbed into his pickup and followed the county road until it turned to gravel, then dirt, then something barely recognizable as either. When he pulled up, Walter was already working. The farmer moved slowly between the rows of trees, pulling a small cultivator, breaking up the top layer just enough to keep moisture in, not enough to destroy structure. The engine sound was steady. Unbothered, Frank stepped out of the truck and just stood there. You could see the line, clear as a fence, though there wasn't one. On one side, his land, bare, scoured, patches of subsoil already showing through. On the other, Walter's, grass between the rows, soil dark and settled, leaves caught in the branches like a net that had done its job. Frank walked forward, boots sinking slightly into ground that still held together. Walter cut the engine. Silence felt different here. "Didn't expect to see you," Walter said. Frank shook his head. "I didn't expect this." Walter wiped his hands on a rag and nodded toward the trees. "Been expecting it for a long time." Frank looked around, then back at him. "You knew this was coming?" Walter shrugged. "Not the day," he said, "but the kind of wind. Yeah." There was a long pause. Frank's confidence, built on numbers, projections, models, didn't quite know where to stand. "You could have told people," he said. Walter met his eyes. "I did." Frank almost smiled at that. Almost, but it didn't land. "Have you ever known you were right when everyone around you said you were wrong? Have you ever watched something you built, slowly, quietly, prove itself in a single moment while everyone else scrambled to understand what just happened?" Frank looked back at the line again. "This doesn't make sense," he said. Walter nodded. "It doesn't," he agreed. "Until it does." The wind picked up again, a smaller gust this time, but enough to send dust skimming across Frank's ruined field. It hit the edge of Walter's trees and stopped, not completely, but enough. Frank watched it happen, really watched it. For the first time, he wasn't looking at Walter like a relic. He was looking at him like a man who knew something he didn't. "What would it take," Frank said slowly, "to do this on my land?" Walter didn't answer right away. He looked out across the trees. The spacing, the angles, the years it had taken to grow them. Then he said something Frank didn't expect. "Time." Frank nodded, almost impatient. "How much?" Walter turned back to him. "More than you think you have." The wind shifted again, and in that moment, Frank realized something that hit harder than the storm itself. He wasn't just behind. He was decades behind. And the only man who could help him catch up was the one he had laughed at 3 days earlier, in front of half the county. The laugh had happened on March 28th, 5 days before the wind. It was at the Harper County Agricultural Extension meeting, held in a low brick building just off Main Street. Coffee in metal urns, folding chairs, a chalkboard that still carried notes from the previous week's crop rotation seminar. Frank stood at the front of the room, sleeves rolled, confidence easy. He had charts, numbers, yield projections calculated down to the acre, the inch, the dollar. Modern farming, he explained, was about maximizing output per unit of land. Every square foot had to produce. And then he pointed at Walter, not cruelly, not at first. "Take Walter's place," he said, smiling. 30 acres tied up in trees. That's 30 acres not producing crop. At current wheat prices, $4.10 a bushel, you're looking at a loss of roughly $12,000 a year in potential revenue. A few men nodded. A few looked uncomfortable. Walter sat in the third row, hat in his lap, hands folded over it. Frank leaned forward, voice louder now. With modern equipment, proper tillage, and optimized planting, that land could be one of the most productive plots in the county. And then someone in the back chuckled. It spread. Not loud, not cruel, but enough. Frank let it happen. Didn't stop it. Didn't need to. "That's not farming," he said lightly. "That's landscaping." The room laughed. Walter didn't. He stood up slowly. Not rushed, not defensive, just deliberate. He put his hat back on, straightened at once, and looked at Frank. "You ever watch the wind cross your land?" he asked. Frank blinked, caught off guard. "Of course," he said. Walter nodded. "Then you know it doesn't care about your numbers." The room went quiet. Frank smiled again, but it didn't land the same way. "We're talking about efficiency, Walter," he said. "Data, results." Walter held his gaze. "Results take time," he said. Frank spread his hands. "And in the meantime, you lose money." Walter shook his head once. "Not everything you lose shows up on a ledger. That should have been the end of it." But Frank laughed, this time louder, this time clear. And that was the moment. That was the pivot. Because every man in that room heard it and remembered it when the wind came. Let me tell you about the Farmel M one more time. By 1974, most of them had been retired, sold off, or left to rust behind barns. But Walter's was different, not because it was special when it left the factory in Rock Island, Illinois in 1948, 40 horsepower, 5-speed transmission, simple hydraulics, but because of what had been done to it since. In 1962, Walter replaced the pistons himself, not because they had failed, but because he knew they would eventually. He didn't wait for breakdowns. He prevented them. In 1968, he reinforced the rear axle housing after noticing a hairline stress fracture most men would have missed. He tuned the carburetor every spring, adjusted timing by ear. That tractor wasn't just maintained. It was understood, and that mattered now. Because while Frank's modern equipment sat idle, too powerful, too aggressive for soil that had already been stripped, Walter's farm moved gently across ground that still had something left to protect. Let me explain something most people misunderstand about horsepower and torque. Horsepower is about speed, how fast you can do work. Torque is about force, how much pulling power you have at low speed. Modern tractors chase horsepower because it looks good on paper. But old machines like the Farmel M were built with strong low-end torque, meaning they could work slowly, steadily, without tearing up the ground they were supposed to protect. Walter didn't need speed. He needed control. And now, that difference was everything. Frank came back the next day, and the day after that. He didn't bring charts this time. He brought questions. What spacing did you use? He asked. Walter showed him. How deep are the roots? Walter dug a small trench with a shovel and let him see. How long before they're effective? Walter looked at the trees, then back at him. 10 years before you notice, he said. 20 before you understand. Frank nodded, writing nothing down, because this wasn't something you captured on paper. This was something you learned by standing in it. Have you ever owned something that everyone else called worthless? Have you ever held on to it anyway, not because you could prove it mattered, but because you felt it did? Frank looked out over his land that afternoon, bare, exposed, waiting for something it didn't yet have. I laughed at you, he said finally. Walter didn't react. I know, he said. Frank swallowed, in front of everyone. Walter nodded. I know that too. There was a long silence, the kind that gives a man room to decide who he's going to be next. I was wrong, Frank said. Walter looked at him, not surprised, not satisfied, just steady. What do you even do about it? He asked. Frank looked back at his fields. The wind had died down, but the damage hadn't. I'm going to start planting, he said. Walter nodded once. Then you better start soon. Frank frowned slightly. Why? Walter turned toward the horizon, because out there, far beyond the county line, another weather system was already forming, and this one wouldn't wait for trees to grow. Frank started planting on April 15th, 1974. Not crops, trees. The first shipment arrived from a nursery in Salina, 500 cottonwood saplings, each about 3 feet tall, bundled in damp burlap, roots wrapped tight to keep them alive through the journey. Cost him $2.75 per tree, more money than he'd ever spent on something that wouldn't produce a harvest that year, or the next. Walter stood with him at the edge of the field that morning, the same field that had lost nearly 4 inches of topsoil in less than a week. You're going to want to angle them, Walter said, pointing with the handle of his shovel. Not straight lines. Wind doesn't move straight. It shifts. Frank nodded, adjusting the stakes. How far apart? 30 feet between rows. 10 feet between trees. Frank paused. That's a lot of land. Walter looked at him. So was the soil you lost. They worked in silence after that. 2 men, one learning something he should have known years ago, one passing it on without saying more than necessary. The Farmel M did most of the work. Slow passes, shallow trenches, careful placement. It never rushed, never toward the ground. It moved like it understood what was at stake. Frank's John Deere sat at the edge of the field. Too big for this job. Too aggressive. Too late. Let me tell you what happened over the next 5 years. By 1979, the first rows had taken hold. Not impressive yet. Thin trunks, leaves still sparse, but enough to break the wind slightly, enough to catch drifting soil and hold it in place. Frank adjusted his farming around them. Smaller fields, more patience, less aggressive tillage. His yields dropped at first. The bank noticed. In 1981, they called him in. "You're underperforming," the loan officer said, flipping through numbers that didn't account for what couldn't be measured yet. Frank didn't argue. "I know," he said. They gave him a warning. He kept planting. By 1984, 10 years after the storm, the difference was visible. Not dramatic, but real. His soil held better. Moisture stayed longer. Yield stabilized, then began to climb. Not because he was pushing harder, but because the land was giving back again. Walter was 78 that year. He didn't work as much. The farm still ran, but slower now, shorter days. He spent more time walking the rows, checking roots, watching the way the wind moved through the branches. Frank visited often, not as a student anymore, as something closer to a partner. "You ever think about clearing any of it?" Frank asked once, half joking. Walter smiled. "Not once." By 1989, 15 years after the storm, Frank's farm looked different from every other in Harper County. Not bigger, not louder, but steadier. The rows of trees, now tall enough to cast real shade, cut the wind into pieces. Soil stayed where it was supposed to. Crops grew more consistently, even in dry years. Other farmers started to notice. Some asked questions, some didn't, but none of them laughed. Walter passed away in November of 1991, peacefully, in his sleep. He was 85. They buried him on a small rise overlooking the 30 acres he had planted 60 years earlier. The trees stood taller than the house by then, roots deep enough to hold not just soil, but memory. Frank spoke at the service. "Not long, not loud. I thought I understood farming," he said. "Turns out I only understood numbers." He looked out at the trees. He understood time. The Farmal M stayed. Frank kept it running. Didn't replace it. Didn't repaint it. Just maintained it the way Walter had. Oil, grease, attention. By 2000, a new generation had taken over parts of the county. Bigger machines, GPS-guided planting, precision agriculture down to the inch. And still, every time the wind came, and it always came, the same thing happened. Soil moved, except where it didn't. Frank's son, Daniel, took over the farm in 2005. He kept the trees, added more, not because he was told to, because he had seen what happened when you didn't. Have you ever changed your mind about something that once felt certain? Have you ever realized that the person you doubted wasn't just right, but ahead of you in ways you couldn't even measure at the time? Daniel never met Walter, but he knew him through the rows, through the soil, through a tractor that still started on the first turn most mornings, even after more than half a century of work. By 2015, the county had started planting trees again. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough to notice. The extension office even held a seminar on windbreak systems. Frank sat in the back, quiet, listening. This time, when someone mentioned trees as a long-term investment, nobody laughed. They nodded because they had seen what happened when the wind came, and they had seen what happened when one man refused to follow the crowd. The Farmal M still runs, not every day, but often enough. Daniel uses it for light work now, small jobs, maintenance, things that don't require speed, just understanding. It sounds the same, deep, steady, certain, like it always did, because some machines aren't built to impress. They're built to last, and some men aren't loud enough to be heard right away. But when the wind comes, you find out exactly who is paying attention. Some things don't protect themselves by force. They protect everything around them by simply refusing to move. If you've ever known someone like Walter, someone who held on to something others dismissed and proved its worth over time, tell me about them in the comments. I read every story. And if you want to hear about the farmer in eastern Colorado who buried an entire tractor to keep it from being repossessed and dug it back up 11 years later to finish the harvest, there's a story waiting for you. You want to be here for that.